In the prestigious world of fine dining, respect is earned through years of dedication. Vivian Reynolds built her career on honesty, integrity, and fair assessment. But when she walks into terroir, Chef Gregory Walsh sees only the color of her skin. What begins as subtle discrimination quickly escalates into public humiliation. The renowned black food critic is forcibly removed from the restaurant, her equipment damaged, her dignity assaulted. But Chef Walsh made one devastating miscalculation. The woman he ejected isn't just any diner, she's one of the most powerful voices in the culinary world and a member of the Michelin Review Committee. Now, with evidence mounting and witnesses coming forward, Vivian must decide between personal vengeance and systematic change. Her investigation uncovers a disturbing pattern of discrimination that extends far beyond one evening. As the truth emerges, Chef Walsh's carefully constructed reputation begins to crumble. In a world where prejudice often goes unchallenged, one woman's stand for dignity becomes an industry-wide reckoning. Should restaurants be held accountable for how they treat all guests, or do we accept that some places aren't for everyone? Share your thoughts in the comments below and join our community of storytellers who believe in justice served right. Vivian Reynolds adjusted her simple gold watch as she reviewed her notes one final time. At 58, she had mastered the art of culinary discretion through 3 decades of food criticism. Her apartment study walls displayed framed reviews from the Chronicle, tastefully arranged alongside her culinary school diploma and various industry awards, all earned through methodical assessment and unwavering objectivity. Heading out soon. Thomas appeared in the doorway, his professor's reading glasses perched on his forehead. At 62, her husband of 34 years still carried himself with the same thoughtful demeanor that had attracted her during that literary symposium so many years ago. Yes, reservations at 7. Terroir has been generating quite the buzz. Vivian closed her leather-bound notebook and slipped it into an understated handbag. Chef Walsh's techniques have been described as revolutionary, though the pricing seems ambitious even for downtown. Thomas smiled, leaning against the doorframe. Your usual approach? Of course. Vivian stood, smoothing her navy blazer. Reservation under Margaret Wilson, discreet note-taking, objective assessment. Her system, perfected over decades, rarely failed her. Though I understand the Michelin committee is watching this one closely. Thomas nodded knowingly. Few outside their immediate family knew of Vivian's role on the prestigious review committee. Her anonymity was paramount, the cornerstone of fair evaluation. Mom, before you go, their daughter Camille appeared, her chef's apron still tied around her waist. At 26, she had inherited Vivian's discerning palate and was midway through an elite culinary program. Would you mind tasting my saffron reduction? I'm not getting the balance quite right. Of course, dear. Vivian followed her daughter to the kitchen, where various ingredients were meticulously arranged. This was family tradition, Camille's education extending beyond formal instruction to include her mother's experienced feedback. Vivian sampled the golden liquid, closing her eyes momentarily. It's quite good, but I detect a slight bitterness. Perhaps reduce your heat and extend the simmering time, let the flavors marry more gradually. Camille nodded, immediately adjusting the burner. That makes sense, thanks, Mom. That's what mothers are for. Vivian checked her watch again. I should head out if I want to arrive precisely on time. Not too early to appear eager, not late enough to seem disrespectful. Thomas retrieved her coat from the closet. Will you be taking photos tonight? Just a few discreet ones with the mini camera. Nothing that would identify me as a critic. She patted her bag where her specialized equipment waited, a small, unobtrusive camera that resembled an ordinary compact, yet captured professional quality images of plating and presentation. The drive downtown was pleasant, autumn leaves spiraling across the boulevards. Vivian mentally reviewed what she knew about terroir. Chef Gregory Walsh had trained in Europe, specialized in modernist cuisine with regional influences, and had rapidly accumulated accolades from several notable publications. His establishment represented a significant investment in the revitalized downtown district. Parking 2 blocks away, never directly in front, Vivian walked briskly toward the restaurant's sleek facade. Its understated exterior belied the reportedly opulent interior. Before entering, she noted the staff's uniforms visible through windows, the flow of service, the apparent satisfaction of departing diners. Good evening, she greeted the hostess pleasantly. Reservation for Wilson, party of 1. The young woman scanned her tablet. Yes, Ms. Wilson, welcome to Terroir, please follow me. Vivian observed everything as they traversed the main dining room, table spacing, lighting intensity, ambient noise levels, staff positioning. Her trained eye noted the efficient movements of servers, the timing between courses at occupied tables, the presentation of wine service. These details would form the foundation of her assessment, regardless of how the food itself might perform. The hostess directed her toward a table near the kitchen entrance, not ideal positioning. Several window tables remained unoccupied despite the restaurant being moderately busy. "I noticed there appear to be window tables available," Vivian mentioned casually. "Might I be seated at one of those instead?" A flicker of hesitation crossed the hostess's face. "I'll need to check if those are reserved." She stepped away briefly, returning with a slight frown. "I'm afraid those are being held for specific reservations, Ms. Wilson. Chef Walsh is quite particular about seating arrangements." "Interesting," Vivian thought, making a mental note. "Already a deviation from standard protocol, prime tables should never remain empty during service unless imminent arrivals were expected." "This will be fine then," she replied graciously, accepting the suboptimal placement. The first test of any establishment was how they handled minor adversity. As Vivian settled in, she observed a tall man in chef whites emerge briefly from the kitchen, scanning the dining room with what appeared to be proprietary satisfaction. His gaze paused momentarily on Vivian, a slight furrow crossing his brow before he disappeared again behind swinging doors. Opening her menu, Vivian began the familiar ritual of assessment. The wine list was impressive, properly curated with appropriate regional pairings. The menu itself struck a confident balance between innovation and accessibility. A server approached, his manner professional if somewhat reserved. "Good evening, madam. May I tell you about our specials this evening?" "Please do," Vivian smiled warmly, "and perhaps recommend a wine pairing for the tasting menu. I'm quite interested in experiencing Chef Walsh's vision as it was intended." As the server described elaborate preparations and ingredients sourced from specific microclimates, Vivian noticed the chef appearing again, this time lingering by the service station, his attention directed unmistakably toward her table. Vivian Reynolds had long ago mastered the art of being simultaneously present and unobtrusive. Tonight, however, something felt different. She sensed she was being watched with uncommon scrutiny. Little did she know that this particular dining experience would unfold quite differently from the hundreds that had preceded it throughout her distinguished career. By evening's end, her commitment to objectivity would be tested in ways that extended far beyond matters of culinary execution. Vivian lifted her water glass, discreetly observing the dining room's dynamics. Despite her reservation being made 3 weeks in advance, she had waited 17 minutes in the reception area, noticeably longer than other arriving guests. Now seated near swinging kitchen doors instead of at one of the 5 empty window tables, she maintained her professional composure while documenting these inconsistencies in her mental checklist. The first course arrived, a small plate featuring geometric arrangements of seasonal vegetables. "Autumn garden with fermented black garlic soil and pickled shallot dew," announced the server, his explanation detailed yet hurried. Vivian noted the plating technique, visually striking but impractical, as several elements had shifted during transport from kitchen to table. She extracted her discreet camera, positioning it low beside her plate. "Excuse me," came a sharp voice. A tall man in pristine chef whites approached her table with deliberate strides. "Photography isn't permitted." Vivian smiled apologetically, immediately returning the camera to her purse. "I apologize, I wasn't aware of the policy." Chef Gregory Walsh, she recognized him from industry publications, did not return her smile. His posture remained rigid, hands clasped behind his back. "It's stated on our website and menu, page 3. His tone suggested this was an unforgivable oversight. "You're absolutely right," Vivian conceded, though she had reviewed the menu thoroughly and remembered no such policy. "I'll certainly respect that." Walsh didn't move away as expected. Instead, he studied her with narrowed eyes. "I don't believe we've met." Gregory Walsh, executive chef and proprietor. "Margaret Wilson," Vivian extended her hand, using her standard pseudonym. "Pleasure to meet you." Walsh's handshake was perfunctory at best. "What brings you to Terroir this evening, Ms. Wilson? Business dinner?" "Simply enjoying an evening out," she replied pleasantly. "Your restaurant has generated considerable interest." "Indeed it has," Walsh agreed, his tone shifting subtly. "Among certain circles. Our clientele tends to be quite discerning." The emphasis wasn't lost on Vivian. She'd encountered this particular brand of scrutiny before, the implication that she might not belong among the discerning. She maintained her professional smile. "I'm looking forward to experiencing your cuisine. The menu is quite ambitious." Walsh's gaze flicked briefly to her simple gold jewelry, her conservative navy blazer. "Ambitious, yes. Not everyone appreciates what we're trying to accomplish here. Our approach requires a certain culinary vocabulary." The chef's presence at her table had become noticeable to nearby diners. A couple at an adjacent table exchanged glances, the woman's expression betraying discomfort at the obvious tension. "I'm sure your guidance will enhance my appreciation," Vivian replied evenly. "Would you recommend the wine pairing with the tasting menu? For those unfamiliar with our concepts, perhaps something more accessible might be appropriate." Walsh gestured to a server who had been hovering nearby. Marcus, perhaps direct Ms. Wilson to our simplified three-course option rather than the full tasting experience. Vivian registered the deliberate downgrade. Actually, I'd prefer the complete tasting menu as originally planned. I'm quite interested in experiencing the full range of your creativity. A muscle twitched in Walsh's jaw. As you wish, though I wonder if the nuances might be lost. The young server, Marcus, appeared increasingly uncomfortable. Chef, Table 9 has requested to speak with you about the lamb preparation. Of course. Walsh's attention shifted immediately, his demeanor transforming as he turned toward Table 9, occupied by two older white couples. My esteemed guests, how are you enjoying your evening? His warmth, so conspicuously absent during their interaction, flowed freely now. Vivian observed as he pulled up a chair, joining their table with animated conversation and genuine laughter. Marcus lingered beside Vivian's table. I apologize for the delay with your first course, ma'am. I bring you some bread while you wait. Thank you, that would be lovely, Vivian replied, noting the server's attempt at compensation. Has Chef Walsh owned Terroir long? 3 years, Marcus answered, his voice lowered. The restaurant's reputation has grown significantly under his direction. I can imagine he seems quite protective of his vision. Marcus glanced toward the kitchen. He has very specific ideas about the dining experience. There was something unspoken in his careful phrasing. Throughout the next 40 minutes, Vivian methodically tasted each course. The food itself displayed technical proficiency, precisely cooked proteins, balanced sauces, innovative textures, yet she couldn't help noticing that the portions served to her appeared consistently smaller than those delivered to other tables. Her wine pours were measurably less generous. Service intervals between her courses stretched noticeably longer. From across the dining room, Walsh watched her table with periodic intensity. When their eyes occasionally met, his expression remained coldly evaluative. During the fourth course, Vivian overheard a comment from the adjacent table. "What's his problem with her?" a woman whispered to her companion. "He's been watching her table all night." Her companion shrugged. "Maybe she's a critic." Walsh emerged from the kitchen again, this time accompanied by a younger chef. He made a deliberate detour past Vivian's table. "Is everything to your satisfaction, Ms. Wilson?" The question carried a subtle challenge. "The techniques are certainly impressive," Vivian answered honestly. "The searing on the duck is exemplary." "High praise," Walsh replied with a tight smile, "though I wonder about your basis for comparison." "I've had the pleasure of dining widely," Vivian offered mildly. Of course, Walsh's tone suggested doubt. "Places like this." Among others, Vivian maintained her composure despite recognizing the clear implication. Walsh smiled without warmth. "Well, we're honored to expand your horizons." As he walked away, the young chef beside him glanced back at Vivian apologetically. His name tag read Alex. By the sixth course, Vivian had compiled substantial mental notes about both the cuisine and the increasingly obvious differential treatment. When her dessert arrived, a deconstructed chocolate composition, she noticed it lacked the gold leaf garnish prominently featured on identical desserts at nearby tables. Walsh approached her table one final time as she was finishing. "Was your first visit to Terroir illuminating, Ms. Wilson?" "Quite revealing," Vivian answered truthfully. "I thought so," Walsh responded, his implication clear. "Some establishments might better suit your particular tastes. Marcus will bring your check shortly." As he walked away, Vivian saw Alex, the young chef from earlier, watching the interaction with evident discomfort from the kitchen doorway. Their eyes met briefly and he quickly looked away. The check, when it arrived, included charges for 2 items Vivian hadn't ordered. A simple error, perhaps, but the cumulative evidence suggested otherwise. What Chef Walsh couldn't possibly know was that Vivian Reynolds had documented every interaction, every discrepancy, and every culinary execution with professional precision. Her years of experience had taught her to recognize when uneven service reflected more than mere oversight. The evening was far from over. This assessment had only just begun. Vivian settled her bill, paying in cash, a habit from years of anonymous reviewing. She deliberately left a generous tip for Marcus, recognizing the server had attempted to provide adequate service despite the chef's obvious interference. As she gathered her belongings, she noted Chef Walsh watching from the service station, his expression unreadable. "Ms. Wilson," a voice called out as she prepared to leave. Chef Walsh approached, intercepting her path toward the exit. "A moment, if you would." Vivian paused, maintaining her professional demeanor. "Of course, Chef Walsh. I couldn't help noticing your scrutiny of our establishment tonight." He positioned himself to block her direct route to the door, his posture deliberately imposing. "You've been taking rather extensive mental notes for someone simply enjoying an evening out." "I'm quite detail-oriented by nature," Vivian replied calmly. "A habit from my professional life." Walsh's eyes narrowed. "And what profession might that be?" "Educational consulting," she answered smoothly, using her standard cover story. "Is that so?" Walsh's tone conveyed clear disbelief. Because your behavior tonight, the questions about ingredients, the attempted photography, the methodical tasting, suggest someone with rather different intentions. Several nearby diners had begun to observe the interaction. Vivian noted at least 3 people shifting uncomfortably in their seats. I assure you, Chef Walsh, I'm simply an appreciative diner. She attempted to step around him. Walsh moved again, maintaining his blocking position. I've been in this industry for 25 years, Ms. Wilson. I recognize when someone doesn't belong in an establishment of this caliber. The statement hung in the air, its implication unmistakable. Vivian felt a familiar tension, one she'd encountered before in spaces where her presence was deemed unexpected or unwanted. I believe fine dining belongs to anyone who appreciates culinary craftsmanship, she replied evenly. Now if you'll excuse me. The issue, Walsh interrupted, his voice rising slightly, is that people like you often lack the background to appreciate what we're creating here. He gestured toward her half-finished dessert. You barely touched the chocolate composition, clearly the subtleties were lost on you. A young woman at a nearby table audibly gasped at the comment. An older gentleman at another table frowned, lowering his fork. Vivian maintained her composure. Chef, I think this conversation has become inappropriate. What's inappropriate, Walsh continued, leaning closer, is pretending to belong somewhere you clearly don't. You'd be more comfortable at one of those chain restaurants downtown. The dining room had grown noticeably quieter. Vivian could see Marcus and another server exchanging concerned glances. From the kitchen doorway, Alex, the young chef, watched with visible distress. Sir, Vivian's voice remained steady despite the public confrontation, your behavior is becoming problematic. I've paid my bill and would like to leave now. Problematic, Walsh's voice rose further. What's problematic is people who can't appreciate fine dining coming here and disrupting the experience for my legitimate customers. From the corner of her eye, Vivian saw several diners shifting uncomfortably. An older couple near the door was requesting their check. She discreetly activated the voice recorder on her phone in her pocket. You're creating a scene, Chef Walsh, Vivian stated calmly. I suggest you allow me to leave quietly. Walsh placed his hand on the back of her chair, effectively cornering her at the table. I suggest you explain exactly why you've been evaluating my restaurant all evening. I've done nothing inappropriate, Vivian maintained her composure. Your treatment of me, however, has been concerning from the moment I arrived. Manager, Walsh called out sharply, not taking his eyes off Vivian. We have a situation. A slim man in a tailored suit approached quickly. What seems to be the problem, Chef? This woman has been disrupting our dining room all evening. I believe she should be escorted out. The manager looked between them uncertainly. Ma'am, has there been some misunderstanding? The only misunderstanding, Vivian replied, is the chef's apparent belief that I don't belong in his restaurant. I've paid my bill and was attempting to leave when he confronted me. Walsh's expression hardened. She's been assessing the restaurant all evening, taking notes, questioning staff. I believe she's a competitor or critic acting in bad faith. Even if that were true, Vivian countered, it wouldn't justify this treatment. The confrontation had now drawn the attention of the entire dining room. Vivian could see several patrons recording the interaction on their phones. Security, Walsh called out sharply. We need to remove a disruptive guest. 2 security personnel appeared with remarkable speed, suggesting they'd been briefed in advance. Both men wore earpieces and dark suits, unusually formal for restaurant security. They flanked Vivian's table with practiced efficiency. This woman has been disrupting our establishment all evening, Walsh declared loud enough for nearby tables to hear. Please escort her out. Vivian maintained her composure, addressing the security personnel directly. I've done nothing disruptive. I've paid my bill and was attempting to leave when Chef Walsh confronted me. The older security guard glanced uncertainly between Vivian and Walsh. Ma'am, we'd prefer if you'd come with us quietly. I'm happy to leave on my own, Vivian replied reasonably. There's no need for an escort. Walsh stepped closer. She's been evaluating our food and service all evening, clearly someone sent by a competitor or a tabloid. She disrupted multiple tables with her behavior. This was an outright fabrication. Vivian looked around, making eye contact with several diners who had witnessed the entire interaction. Some looked away uncomfortably, but others returned concerned glances. That's simply untrue, Vivian stated calmly, still recording on her phone. I dined quietly until Chef Walsh began this confrontation. The second security guard moved behind her chair. Ma'am, please come with us now. When Vivian stood to gather her belongings, Walsh gestured impatiently. Just remove her. The younger guard grasped Vivian's arm firmly. We need to go now. I'm complying, please don't touch me, Vivian said, her voice steady despite the public humiliation unfolding. The guard maintained his grip as they began moving toward the exit. My purse, Vivian attempted to retrieve her bag from the table. I'll bring it, the older guard stated, grabbing her belongings hastily. In the process, her specialized camera fell to the floor with an audible crack. That's delicate equipment, Vivian protested. Should have thought about that before causing problems, Walsh replied smugly as the guard roughly scooped up the broken camera. As they proceeded through the dining room, Vivian maintained her dignity despite the spectacle. Diners watched with expressions ranging from confusion to outright concern. A woman at a corner table was recording the entire incident on her phone. Walsh followed behind, addressing the dining room theatrically. My apologies for the disruption, everyone. At Terroir, we maintain certain standards for our guests. Some people simply don't understand the proper decorum for establishments of this caliber. The thinly veiled implication hung in the air. Several diners exchanged uncomfortable glances. An older gentleman stood up from his table. This seems rather excessive, doesn't it? Walsh ignored him, continuing toward the exit. Please enjoy the remainder of your evening. Complimentary dessert wine for everyone. The bribe for silence was transparent. Vivian noted at least 3 more diners filming the incident as she was marched through the restaurant. At the entrance, Alex, the young chef who had appeared uncomfortable earlier, watched with evident distress. Their eyes met briefly as Vivian was hustled past. Outside, the security personnel released her arm, practically pushing her onto the sidewalk. The older guard thrust her purse toward her. Your things, ma'am. Vivian accepted her bag, immediately checking for her broken camera. The specialized lens was shattered, the housing cracked. This was unnecessarily aggressive, she stated, maintaining her professional demeanor despite the situation. I hope you realize that. The guards exchanged glances but said nothing before returning inside. Through the glass doors, Vivian could see Walsh watching, arms crossed in satisfaction. Vivian took a deep breath, centering herself after the confrontation. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for her phone, the first visible sign of how deeply the incident had affected her. She stopped the recording and immediately backed it up to her cloud storage. As she reviewed the damage to her camera, the restaurant door opened again. Alex, the young chef, emerged cautiously, glancing back over his shoulder. Ms. Wilson, he approached hesitantly, I'm so sorry about what happened in there. That was completely unacceptable. Vivian studied him carefully. Thank you for saying so. You're on Chef Walsh's staff. Alex Harmon, Sue's chef. He offered his hand. What happened to you in there? It wasn't the first time. Chef Walsh has a pattern of singling out certain customers. Vivian's professional instincts engaged immediately. A pattern? Alex glanced nervously at the door. I can't talk here, but this isn't right and it keeps happening. He quickly handed her a business card. My personal number is on the back. If you're planning to do something about tonight, I want to help. Before Vivian could respond, Alex hurried back inside, leaving her standing on the sidewalk with his card and her damaged property. Vivian took a moment to collect herself before walking to her car. Once inside, she finally allowed herself to process the events. After 30 years in the industry, she'd encountered discrimination before, but rarely so blatant, so public, and so clearly targeted. She dialed her husband's number, her voice finally betraying her distress when he answered. Thomas. Something happened at the restaurant. I'm on my way home. As she drove, Vivian's mind was already organizing the incident into categories of evidence, witnesses, and potential next steps. This wasn't merely about a negative review anymore. What transpired at Terroir demanded a more substantive response, one that addressed not just tonight's discrimination, but the pattern Alex had referenced. Chef Walsh had no idea who he'd actually confronted tonight. More importantly, he had no idea what was coming next. Vivian sat at her home office desk early the next morning, multiple documents organized in precise stacks before her. Her laptop displayed the recorded audio from the previous night, visualized as sound waves with key moments already timestamped and annotated. Here's your tea, Thomas said, placing a steaming cup beside her notes. How are you structuring your approach? Systematically, Vivian replied, gesturing to her organized materials. I've documented the timeline of events with supporting evidence, categorized the violations by type, and identified potential witnesses. Now I'm establishing the formal complaint channels. Thomas examined the broken camera on her desk. This alone constitutes property damage. Yes, but it's the pattern that concerns me most. Vivian opened her email, displaying a message she'd received at 6:17 a.m. My editor at the Chronicle is fully supportive. She's already received 3 independent reports from diners who witnessed the incident. Vivian pulled up a document template. I'm filing complaints with the Restaurant Association, the Better Business Bureau, and the city's Equal Opportunity Commission. But first, she picked up her phone, examining Alex Harmon's business card. I need to understand if this was an isolated incident or part of a systemic issue. She dialed the number, putting the call on speaker. Ms. Wilson. Alex answered immediately. I was hoping you'd call. Mr. Harmon, I'd like to discuss what happened last night in more detail. Would you be comfortable with that? A pause. Yes, but not over the phone. Could we meet somewhere? They arranged to meet at a coffee shop 20 minutes later. Vivian gathered her recorder and notebook methodically. Be careful, Thomas cautioned. if Walsh discovers this meeting. Documentation protects everyone, Vivian replied, her journalist's instincts fully engaged. The coffee shop was half empty when Alex arrived, nervous energy evident in his movements. He sat across from Vivian, speaking in low tones. "What happened to you wasn't isolated," he began without preamble. "Chef Walsh has a system for identifying undesirable guests. He calls it maintaining standards, but it's clearly targeted discrimination." "Can you elaborate?" Vivian asked, recorder capturing every word with his permission. Alex detailed a disturbing pattern. Walsh regularly instructed hosts to seat minorities and people he deemed inappropriate near kitchen areas regardless of reservation status. Service staff were subtly directed to provide inferior service. Special instructions flagged certain tables for quality control, a euphemism for deliberate service reduction. "I've documented 17 incidents in the past 4 months," Alex stated, sliding a USB drive across the table. "Staff schedules, internal communications, incident reports." Walsh requires staff to file reports when guests disrupt the dining environment, but the only disruption is usually their presence in his establishment. "Why are you sharing this?" Vivian asked directly. Alex met her gaze. "I became a chef because food brings people together. What's happening at Terroir is the opposite of that. Several staff have quit already. Those of us remaining either need the job or are gathering evidence." "Evidence suggests a coordinated effort," Vivian observed. "Has anyone filed formal complaints?" 3 former employees tried. The restaurant association dismissed them. Walsh sits on their executive board. One server filed with the Equal Opportunity Commission, but Walsh's legal team buried it with procedural delays. Vivian made careful notes. "What about customer complaints?" "Systematically discredited. Walsh claims they're competitors or people seeking free meals. The restaurant's prestige shields him." As they spoke, Vivian received an email alert. Her editor had published a brief account of the incident online, without naming Vivian but detailing the discrimination. "It's starting," she told Alex, showing him the article. "More witnesses will likely come forward now." Alex nodded, checking his watch nervously. "There's something else you should know. Terroir is being considered for a Michelin star. The formal review is scheduled within weeks." Vivian maintained her neutral expression despite this significant revelation. "I see. Walsh has been fixated on it, implementing strict protocols for handling reviewer situations. Your treatment directly violated those protocols, which shows how his biases override even his ambitions." Returning home, Vivian immediately began correlating Alex's documents with her own evidence. By evening, she had compiled a comprehensive report documenting 23 incidents of targeted discrimination against minority patrons. Internal communications revealing explicit bias in seating and service policies. Financial records showing differential charging practices. Staff testimonials describing systematic discrimination. She forwarded the complete file to her editor with a note. "This extends beyond a restaurant review. This is institutional discrimination with documented pattern and practice." While preparing her formal complaints, Vivian's phone rang, a representative from the restaurant association. "Ms. Reynolds, we understand you had an unfortunate experience at Terroir." "Yes," Vivian confirmed, maintaining her professional tone, though unfortunate significantly understates what occurred. "Chef Walsh has provided his account of the incident," the representative continued, "suggesting you were evaluating his restaurant inappropriately and disrupting other diners. I have audio recordings, photographs, and multiple witness statements contradicting that claim," Vivian replied calmly. "Additionally, I've documented a pattern of similar incidents targeting minority patrons." A pause. "Chef Walsh is a respected member of our association with an impeccable reputation." "Makes his behavior even more concerning," Vivian interjected. "I'm filing a formal complaint with supporting evidence. I expect it will receive appropriate consideration despite his position on your board." The representative's tone shifted noticeably. "Of course, Ms. Reynolds, we take all complaints seriously." By day's end, Vivian had initiated formal proceedings with 5 different organizations. Her editor had published a follow-up piece including accounts from 4 additional witnesses. Social media was beginning to circulate accounts of the incident. Just before midnight, an email arrived from an unfamiliar address. "Ms. Reynolds, my name is Marcus Williams, server at Terroir. 4 of us want to speak with you about our experiences working under Chef Walsh. Your incident wasn't the first, but we hope it will be the last. Please contact me if you're willing to meet." Vivian forwarded the message to her editor with a single comment. The pattern emerges. The Michelin Committee's quarterly review meeting occupied a private room at the Westbrook Hotel. 12 industry veterans sat around a polished mahogany table, each with identical black portfolios before them. Regional Director James Peterson presided at the head, orchestrating the systematic review of each establishment under consideration. Moving to our final candidate for today, Peterson announced, Terroir by Chef Gregory Walsh. Initial assessments indicate technical excellence in execution, though some inconsistency in service delivery. The door opened quietly as Peterson was speaking. A woman in a tailored suit entered, nodding apologetically for her tardiness. Ms. Reynolds, Peterson acknowledged. We were just beginning the terroir assessment. Vivian took her seat, arranging her materials with practiced precision. My apologies for the delay, I was finalizing some relevant documentation. Peterson continued, as I was saying, terroir has demonstrated considerable potential. Chef Walsh's technical execution shows innovation while honoring classical foundations. The committee's preliminary recommendation is positive, pending final assessment. Vivian remained silent as several committee members offered their observations. The discussion followed standard protocol: culinary execution, menu coherence, ingredient sourcing, service standards, atmosphere, and consistency measures. After 20 minutes of detailed analysis, Peterson turned to Vivian. Ms. Reynolds, you've been uncharacteristically quiet. Your assessment was scheduled for last week. Do you have insights to share? Yes, Vivian replied calmly. My experience suggests we should reconsider this recommendation. A murmur circulated around the table. Vivian Reynolds rarely advocated against an establishment with such promising technical merits. That's unexpected, Peterson remarked. Your concerns? Fundamental violations of service standards and equity principles, Vivian answered, opening her portfolio. I've documented systematic discrimination that compromises the core values our recognition is meant to uphold. She distributed copies of a meticulously organized report to each committee member. My personal experience was merely the catalyst for this investigation. The pattern is extensive and deliberate. The committee reviewed her materials in silence. Photographs, testimonials, internal communications, and financial records collectively revealed a troubling pattern of discriminatory practices at Terroir. This is concerning, Peterson finally stated. However, our primary focus remains culinary excellence. Service issues, while important, are secondary considerations. With respect, Vivian countered, our guidelines clearly state that recognition requires consistency across all dimensions of the dining experience. Discriminatory practices fundamentally violate that standard. Another committee member interjected. Chef Walsh's techniques are revolutionary. Perhaps isolated service incidents shouldn't overshadow his culinary achievements. These aren't isolated incidents, Vivian replied, her tone remaining measured. Page 7 documents 27 cases following identical patterns. Page 12 contains testimony from 8 current and former staff members confirming these practices are systematic and directed by Chef Walsh himself. The room fell silent as committee members processed the evidence. Peterson studied the materials carefully before addressing the group again. This presents a significant dilemma. The technical merits are undeniable, but these practices are deeply problematic. The discussion that followed was rigorous, examining both the evidence and the committee's responsibility to uphold standards beyond mere technical execution. After 40 minutes of deliberation, Peterson called for a preliminary vote. Those in favor of proceeding with Terroir's consideration given these revelations, only 2 hands raised. Those opposed, 9 hands, including Vivian's, rose decisively. Motion to remove Terroir from consideration passes, Peterson declared. Ms. Reynolds, given your direct involvement, please prepare the official assessment documenting our decision. The following morning, Chef Walsh received the committee's formal notification. 15 minutes later, Vivian's office phone rang. Reynolds speaking. You had no right, Walsh's voice carried barely controlled fury. You've destroyed years of work with your vendetta. Chef Walsh, Vivian replied evenly, I'm documenting this call. I don't care what you document. You targeted my restaurant because you felt personally offended. This is professional sabotage. The committee's decision was based on documented evidence of systematic discriminatory practices confirmed by multiple sources and witnesses. Your culinary execution was never in question. So you admit you're behind this, Walsh demanded. I performed my professional responsibility as a committee member, Vivian stated. Your own actions determine the outcome. You have no idea who you're dealing with, Walsh threatened. I have connections throughout this industry. As do I, Vivian replied calmly. Which is why the Restaurant Association has also received my report, along with the Better Business Bureau and the Equal Opportunity Commission. Your practices violated multiple standards and potentially several laws. Silence hung for several seconds before Walsh responded, his tone suddenly calculating. What would it take to resolve this? Perhaps we've had a misunderstanding that could be rectified. This isn't a negotiation, Chef Walsh. The evidence has been submitted to appropriate authorities. The resolution will come through proper channels and necessary reforms. The line went dead as Walsh terminated the call. 20 minutes later, Vivian's editor called. Walsh's PR team just issued a statement claiming your review was compromised by personal bias and hidden identity. A predictable deflection, Vivian noted. Our documentation is comprehensive. His attack on my professional integrity only reinforces the pattern of behavior we've identified. The story's gaining traction, her editor confirmed. 3 more former employees have come forward since this morning. The Restaurant Association is initiating a formal review of Walsh's membership status. By afternoon, local news outlets had picked up the story. Social media circulated video clips from diners who had witnessed Vivian's ejection. Food blogs began publishing accounts from other patrons who had experienced similar treatment. At 4:30 p.m., Vivian received an unexpected call from the Equal Opportunity Commission. Ms. Reynolds, your documentation has been extremely helpful. We're expediting our investigation based on the pattern you've identified. Would you be available to provide formal testimony next week? The systematic approach Vivian had employed throughout her career, meticulous documentation, objective assessment, and principled action, had transformed what could have been dismissed as a personal grievance into an irrefutable case for institutional accountability. Vivian adjusted her blazer as she approached the podium in the Restaurant Association's grand ballroom. 6 weeks had transformed what began as a discriminatory incident into a watershed moment for the industry. The room was filled with over 200 culinary professionals gathered for the association's quarterly meeting. Thank you for allowing me to address this assembly, Vivian began, her voice steady and measured. Today marks an important step toward ensuring our industry truly serves everyone with equal respect and dignity. The investigation had progressed with methodical precision. The Equal Opportunity Commission had completed its expedited review, substantiating all key allegations. The Restaurant Association's Ethics Committee had conducted its own independent assessment, resulting in unprecedented actions against one of its board members. The reforms being implemented today aren't about a single establishment or individual, Vivian continued. They address systemic issues requiring institutional accountability. The association's president, Ruby Chen, joined Vivian at the podium. Today, we're announcing comprehensive changes to our certification and review standards. All member establishments will now undergo bias assessment as part of their regular evaluations. Training requirements for both management and staff will include explicit anti-discrimination components. Our ethics review process has been restructured to ensure independent investigation of all complaints. The announcement represented the culmination of intense negotiations following the public exposure of Walsh's practices. Terroir's Michelin consideration had been permanently withdrawn. The Restaurant Association had suspended Walsh's membership pending completion of mandatory sensitivity training and operational reforms. Most significantly, Walsh had been removed from operational control of his restaurant by its investment group after the mounting evidence threatened their broader portfolio. As Vivian returned to her seat, she noticed Alex Harmon seated several rows ahead. No longer just a sous chef, he had been appointed interim executive chef at Terroir while the restaurant underwent comprehensive operational restructuring. Their eyes met briefly, an unspoken acknowledgement of the transformation their courage had initiated. 3 months later, Vivian sat at a corner table in the renovated Terroir dining room. The space had been thoughtfully redesigned, more welcoming with improved sight lines and accessibility. The menu had evolved as well, maintaining technical excellence while celebrating diverse culinary influences. Alex approached her table, now confidently wearing the executive chef's jacket. Ms. Reynolds, thank you for giving us another opportunity to serve you. The changes are impressive, Vivian noted genuinely. Both visible and operational. We've implemented comprehensive training for all staff, Alex explained. Our hiring practices have been completely restructured. The investment group has been surprisingly supportive once they recognized the business benefits of inclusive excellence. Vivian nodded appreciatively. And Mr. Walsh, completing his required training program, Alex replied. The investment group has restructured his role to remove him from direct customer interaction. He's been reassigned to menu development only, with extensive oversight. The meal that followed demonstrated that the restaurant's culinary standards remained impeccable while its service philosophy had undergone fundamental transformation. Every guest received identical treatment, attentive, respectful, and professional. As Vivian completed her dessert, a perfectly executed chocolate composition, complete with gold leaf garnish, her daughter Camille arrived for their planned meeting. "Sorry I'm late, Mom," Camille apologized, taking the seat across from her. Final preparations for the scholarship program took longer than expected. The Vivian Reynolds Culinary Equity Scholarship had become an unexpected outcome of the incident. Funded by a settlement from Terroir's investment group, it would support 5 minority students annually at the region's premier culinary institute. The first recipients have been selected, Camille continued excitedly. Their backgrounds are impressive, so much untapped talent that might never have had the opportunity. Alex returned to their table, greeting Camille warmly. Your mother's actions have transformed not just our restaurant but potentially the industry. We're implementing a mentorship program specifically for aspiring chefs from underrepresented communities. As they discussed future collaborations, Vivian reflected on the broader impact of what had begun as a single discriminatory encounter. The incident had catalyzed institutional reforms across multiple organizations. New industry standards were being adopted by restaurant groups nationwide. Most importantly, pathways were opening for diverse talent previously excluded from high-end culinary spaces. Mom, they're asking if you'd consider serving as keynote speaker at the scholarship announcement, Camille mentioned. Your perspective would be valuable. Vivian considered the request thoughtfully. Throughout her career, she had maintained professional anonymity, evaluating without being evaluated, observing without being observed. The events of recent months had shifted that paradigm, placing her expertise and experiences in a broader context of advocacy and accountability. I would be honored, she finally replied. After Camille departed, Vivian completed her assessment notes for the renovated terroir. The establishment had maintained its technical excellence while demonstrating genuine commitment to equitable service. Her review would acknowledge both the previous failures and the meaningful reforms now evident in every aspect of the dining experience. As she prepared to leave, Alex approached one final time. Ms. Reynolds, I wanted to thank you personally. Your actions required courage, but they've created space for others to demonstrate their own courage too. Vivian smiled. Accountability and excellence should never be mutually exclusive. Your leadership here proves that. Outside, the evening air carried the first hints of autumn, a fitting reminder that seasons change, institutions evolve, and principles ultimately prevail when upheld with systematic determination and unwavering purpose. The experience had reinforced what Vivian had always known. In both culinary assessment and matters of justice, the most powerful approach remained the same: document everything, follow proper channels, maintain composure, and persistently pursue systematic change rather than merely personal vindication. In the final accounting, dignity had prevailed over revenge, justice over retaliation, and community over individual, precisely as it should.